If you're watching this video, I am guessing you're having a little bit of a problem finding bets for this weekend's UFC Fight Night Dolidze versus Hernandez card. You may have some parlays and accumulators because most of this card features heavy favourites, so you might have thrown some of these into a parlay or an accumulator. But other than that, it's a very difficult card for betting. So if you're sat this weekend planning to watch this UFC event live and you want to make some money, consider joining my live betting group. We make a profit on around 70% of UFC events over the last 10 years. As you can see, this is one of the most impressive profitability charts you will ever see. We make a profit almost every week, and if you join the live betting group, you're absolutely going to love it. Cards like this can be very tough for pre-fight betting because, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the 12 fights this weekend feature heavy favourites at an implied probability of 70% or even worse. So it's very challenging to make money pre-fight betting a card like this, but you can make a lot of money live betting a card like this, and these are the type of events we tend to thrive on, we tend to specialise in, and we tend to make pretty good profits on events like this most weeks. So consider joining my live betting group. A lot of the guys in my group have been with me for years, and this weekend's event is our bread and butter. The reason being, there are very few people in the world that will put as much time into researching these fights as I will. Most people watch the UFC for entertainment, or they're not prepared to work as hard as I am to research these fighters and gain an edge. So I've spent 30 hours this week researching every single fighter on this card. I know all their strengths and weaknesses. I know how they all match up stylistically. And as well as sharing that information with you for the main card fights in today's YouTube video, when it comes to live betting these fights on Saturday night, we're going to be able to use that research and that in-depth knowledge of how all these fighters match up from a stylistic point of view to give us an excellent chance of making money betting this card. And as you can see, we make a profit on around 70% of UFC events. So guys, if you're not part of the team yet, join the fucking team. Link in the description below. So let's kick things off by breaking down the main event of this weekend's card, which is going to be Roman Dolidze versus Anthony Hernandez. So if we take a look at the odds, we can see that Hernandez is one of many big favourites this week. This is like a boxing card because we've got 10 heavy favourites at an implied probability of around 70% or worse, and there's only 12 fights on this card. So absolutely shocking. You can see all these big favourites here. But Dolidze is the underdog at average odds of around 3.55, which is going to be plus 255 for an implied probability of 28%. And we can see that Hernandez is the favourite at average odds of around 1.32, which is going to be minus 312 for an implied probability of 76%. So Dolidze, 37 years old, 6'2", with a 76-inch reach. Hernandez, 31 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 75-inch reach. So we can see both guys are about the same size, but we can see Hernandez is 6 years younger than Dolidze, which does give him a pretty big advantage in this fight because at 37 years old, Dolidze is at that stage in his career where he's getting pretty old now, and you'd expect him to be starting to decline from fight to fight. So younger fighters win around 65% of the time when there's a 6-year age gap in a fight, which does give Hernandez pretty big advantage in this matchup. Now, this is one of those fights where I was very disappointed in the odds because I would love to bet Hernandez in this matchup, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to because he's too big of a favourite. This should be a very easy fight for Anthony Hernandez. Obviously, Dolidze is going to have the advantage when it comes to striking, although to be fair to Hernandez, he does fight at a very high pace on the feet, but defensively he's not the best, and Dolidze does hit pretty hard. Having said that, if you look at Dolidze's record, I do feel his power is a bit overstated. Yes, he's fought some tough guys in his last 5 fights, but he hasn't really knocked anyone out since he knocked out Phil Hawes all the way back in 2022. He doesn't really have a knockout in the last 3 years, which isn't great, and 4 of his last 5 have gone to a decision. So Dolidze, when he first came into the UFC, had a couple big knockouts, had a bit of a reputation for being a KO artist, but that's not really the case in reality anymore, and he's more of a volume striker. On top of that, Hernandez is a pretty tough fucker. We saw him hurt bad early in the Michel Pereira fight. He pushed through, he hung in there, and he was able to, in the end, get the job done, get a very impressive dominant win. But obviously the first round was pretty dicey for him. So I don't see Dolidze being able to cause Hernandez too much of a problem on the feet. In fact, with Hernandez's pace, he may end up outstriking Dolidze. And when it comes to the grappling, Hernandez should absolutely dominate. Again, Dolidze's got a reputation for being like a strong, dangerous MMA grappler, but he isn't really. The fights like the Trevin Giles matchup show that he is quite a low level on the ground. He has hit some Hail Mary submissions here and there, which are clouding people's judgment. But I think people are going to see on Saturday night the skill gap between these two on the ground is going to be massive. On top of that, Dolidze's takedown defense is pretty bad. So Hernandez should have no problems getting this fight to the ground and no problems out-hustling Dolidze and outworking him on the ground. Very good stylistic matchup for Hernandez. Very easy stylistic matchup for Hernandez. And I would expect him to win very comfortably, very dominantly this weekend. In terms of the over-under on this one, it is tricky actually. My gut tells me that this fight won't go to a decision because Hernandez is so aggressive and so active on the ground in pursuing a finish that I think he will tire Dolidze out and probably get a stoppage on the ground when Dolidze becomes too tired to defend himself, kind of like what he did to Michel Pereira. Having said that, Dolidze is a tough fucker. Won't be easy to get him out of there, but 25 minutes is a long time. So personally, I think the fight will not go to a decision. And if you do want to bet the over-under on this one, I would say take fight ends inside the distance. Now, in terms of props, was Hernandez by decision? Terrible. Was Hernandez by knockout TKO? Not great. Hernandez by submission. Yeah, the thing is, I could see... Yeah, Hernandez wins by submission and knockout TKO is about the same. It's not about a 25% difference in the odds. Yeah, I would give that a miss. Personally, I would give that a miss. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Steve Erceg against Ode Osbourne. And another huge favourite here. Erceg is an average of around 1.18, which is going to be minus 556 for an implied probability of 85%. If we take a look at the odds on Osbourne, he is around an average of, it's quite a big odd spread, we'll say 5.25, which is going to be plus 425 for an implied probability of 19%. So Erceg, 30 years old, 5'8" with a 68.5 inch reach. Osbourne, 33 years old, 5'7" with a 73 inch reach. So bit of a reach advantage for Osbourne, and aside from that, pretty even. So I'm quite surprised Erceg is a massive favourite in this fight. I know Osbourne is coming in on short notice, with Erceg originally scheduled to face Alex Perez. But yeah, man, it's one of those situations where I do get Erceg is the favourite. It's just him being this big of a favourite is a little bit absurd in my opinion. So this is one of those fights where if it stays on the feet, it's kind of like the volume of Erceg versus the power of Osbourne. Osbourne does have big power, definitely has the power to knock Erceg out. And if this fight stays standing, I could actually see Osbourne, outstriking Erceg and winning pretty comfortably, either by outpointing him or actually knocking him out. Now, on the ground is where things get tough for Osbourne. Osbourne's takedown defense is bad. He's a very low level on the ground. And if you do take him down, he's the kind of guy that will just lie on his back, doing absolutely nothing, making no attempt to get back up to his feet. And we know that Erceg is a pretty good MMA grappler. The thing about Erceg is that he doesn't really shoot many takedowns, and he's one of those guys that kind of is very reluctant to grapple in fights where he should definitely be grappling a lot. So yeah, this is one of those matchups where, for me, it's an easy fight for Erceg if he grapples, but I can't trust him to grapple. Therefore, there's no way you can really play him at these crazy odds at an implied probability of, 85%. That's just absurd. So yeah, this is one of those fights where if you really want to bet it, you have to go Osbourne. It is dog or pass. This fight is an IQ test. You'd be crazy to bet Erceg at an implied probability of 85% because you can't trust him to grapple, and Osbourne definitely has the striking to cause him big problems. But at the same time, if Erceg does grapple this weekend, then Osbourne is absolutely screwed. So very difficult fight for betting. Very easy pass. In terms of the most likely outcomes, I think most likely outcome is Erceg by decision. He's not the most dangerous guy. Like if you check his record, even when he was facing relatively low level of opponent early in the UFC, a couple of his first two fights went to a decision. He's more of a volume guy than a finisher with a killer instinct. So the only prop we consider would be Erceg by decision, but the odds are absolutely terrible. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Angela Hill versus Yasmin Lucindo. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Lucindo is the favourite, average odds of about 1.53, which is going to be minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. And if we take a look at the odds on Hill, she's around an average of, say, quite a big odds spread. We'll say 2.55, which is going to be plus 155 for an implied probability of 39%. So Lucindo is 23 years old, 5'3", with a 66-inch reach, and Hill 5'3", with a 64.5-inch reach. So they're about the same size, but you can see there is an enormous, let me get my calculator out for this one, 17-year age gap. This might be one of the biggest age gaps we've ever seen in a UFC fight. We don't have stats for how often the younger fighter wins when there's a 17-year age gap in a fight, but I'd imagine it's astronomically huge. But we do know that when there's a 10-year age gap in a fight, the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time. So we'll go with that. So this is an interesting matchup because obviously this is a young person's sport and Hill should be declining a lot from fight to fight. Having said that, she's not really showing many signs of decline. If anything, in recent years, Hill has put in some of the best performances of her career, and you can actually see this is probably the best run of her career, winning 3 of her last 4. She'd have this little winning streak back in 2020, but other than that, it's been pretty choppy for Hill. So her recent form kind of reflects the fact that at this stage in her career, for a 40-year-old, she's not bad. Still durable, reflex is still good, cardio not bad. That was an issue for Hill at one point in her career. It's not so much of an issue before. She does slow down a bit as fights wear on, but nothing particularly huge. So yeah, this is one of those fights where I wouldn't treat Hill like the average 40-year-old because she's not like one of these shot old veterans that can't take a shot and reflexes are totally gone and she's gassy and not that athletic. Hill is a bit of an outlier, and that's the important thing about working with trends, right? Trends are great, and trends are a great way to make money if you consistently back them in the right situations, but there will always be outliers. And with situations like this, while I wouldn't necessarily bet on Hill in this fight because I don't think it would be smart to try and cherry pick the 30% of the time when the older fighter does beat the younger fighter when there's a 10 or more year age gap in a fight. I think Hill is a very live underdog in this matchup, and this is one of the most interesting fights on the card. So in terms of how these two match up stylistically, I would give Lucindo the advantage on the feet, mainly just due to power and physicality. So Hill's never been the most powerful or physically imposing fighter. Hill is one of these fighters that is very much a volume striker, light on her feet, good footwork, good movement, technical, but she's never really had the power to hurt you. And we've seen situations where Hill has landed a really high volume of strikes, but she just hasn't really been able to cause her opponent too much trouble. Whereas Lucindo genuinely hits hard. She's powerful, and while Hill is tough and she can take a shot and she is durable, even though Hill may land more volume in this fight, I think it's going to be really difficult for her to win rounds on the feet beyond all reasonable doubt, because Lucindo is going to be landing the harder, more damaging strikes to get a big reaction or leave a bigger impression on the judges. So on the feet, I would give Lucindo the advantage. The problem for Lucindo is on the ground, because as we saw in the Amanda Lemos fight, She is one of these fighters that if you take her down, put her on her back, she will just lay on her back and looks totally clueless and just doesn't know how to get back up to her feet. This was somewhat masked in her first 5 fights in the UFC because she only fought strikers and none of them really tried that hard to take her down. Yaragui, striker. Walker, striker. Viana, BJJ girl / striker but doesn't have any wrestling. Kovalkiewicz, striker. Rodriguez, striker. Lemos is also a striker, but Lemos also fought really smart and came into the fight with a grappling heavy game plan, kind of exposed Lucindo pretty bad. So what's interesting about that is that the blueprint has been written on how to beat Lucindo. Now, at 23 years old, she is going to be making big improvements from fight to fight, or at least she should be. You'd hope she would be. But what's interesting about this one is that Lemos has now shown the world how you beat Lucindo and how you have a very easy night against her. If you just grapple, you've got a very good chance of winning. And obviously, Hill has incorporated a lot more grappling into her game plans and strategies in recent years. You can see her winning by mounted guillotine here. Earlier in Hill's career, she was just a pure striker, but now she's very much a well-rounded mixed martial artist, and she shoots takedowns in almost every fight now. So Hill's got decent cardio, decent MMA grappling. Not the best grappling control, but it doesn't really matter when you're facing someone like Lucindo that'll just lie on her back, making no attempt to get back up to her feet if you take her down. So this one of those fights where if Hill comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, she should win easily, so long as Lucindo hasn't improved tons since her last fight against Lemos. And she could have done, it's possible. She is small, muscular, compact, athletic, strong. It is bizarre why she is as weak on her back as she is, but Hill's got a clear and obvious path to victory here. So if you want to bet this fight, it's clearly dog or pass. Let the odds do the work for you. You would literally have to be an insane person to bet on Lucindo at pretty big favourite odds when we've seen her look very bad on the ground against Lemos, and we know Hill is very capable of doing to Lucindo exactly what Lemos did. So yeah, this is clearly dog or pass. If you want to bet this fight, you have to take Angela Hill or nothing, in my opinion. And in terms of the over-under, very, very likely this fight will go to a decision. You can see the odds reflect that, with them being very steep favourite odds. In terms of the props, the only one I would consider would be Hill by decision. Where are the odds on that? Hill by decision. But the odds on Hill by decision are pretty much the same as Hill moneyline. So if you want to bet, there's like very little difference in percentage terms in the odds. So if you want to bet this fight, don't overcomplicate it, don't get cute. I would just take Hill moneyline, and I really hope she comes through for you. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Christian Rodriguez versus Andre Fili. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Rodriguez is the favourite at average odds of about 1.42, which is going to be minus 238 for an implied probability of 70%. And if we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Fili, he's around an average of 2.90, which is going to be plus 190 for an implied probability of 34%. So we can see that Fili is 35 years old, 5'11", with a 74-inch reach. Rodriguez, 27 years old, 5'7", with a 71-inch reach. So we can see Fili is a little bit longer and taller. We say that about Fili in every fight. He is quite long and tall for a featherweight. And we can also see there's an 8-year age gap, which is pretty significant because these guys are at the stage in their careers where age stats are quite meaningful. At 27 years old, Rodriguez should be making big improvements from fight to fight. And at 35 years old, Fili is getting very old for a featherweight. And actually, I do think we are starting to see decline in Fili. He used to be one of those guys who was a cardio machine, would fight at a very high pace, throw a very high volume of strikes, but getting outstruck by Cub Swanson. I mean, he's squeaked by with a split decision, but Andre Fili should not be going to a split decision against a 41-year-old featherweight in essentially what was a stand-up fight. Not a good look for Fili. Should have made that look very easily, and he actually should have made it look very easy, and he actually struggled. So this is one of those matchups where Fili, is on a decline. He is slowing down. Cardio not as good as he used to be. Reflexes not as good as he used to be. He's not as sharp as he used to be. So both these guys, Rodriguez and Fili, definitely on opposite career trajectories. And we know that the younger fighter wins close to 70% of the time when there's an 8-year age gap in a fight, which does give Rodriguez a pretty big statistical advantage. And again, when it comes to fights like this, I just don't want to fight the trend. At the end of the day, it's far easier to find situations like, when you can bet with a trend that plays out 70% of the time in your favour than trying to cherry pick those 30% of situations where you're going against the trend and hoping to defy the trend. You're much better, moving with the wind at your back. Much easier to push a boulder down a mountain than up a mountain. You want to be betting with trends on your side. You don't want to be fighting strong trends like this. There's no way I can touch Fili in this fight. But in terms of how they match up stylistically, I do think the fight is closer than the odds potentially suggest. I don't think there's a massive skill gap between these two on the feet. Of course, it's difficult to gauge what Fili's going to look like at this stage in his career. He is definitely declining, but both these guys are volume strikers. Both are reasonably technical. Rodriguez is the better boxer, but Fili throws a more diverse range of strikes. What is interesting about Rodriguez, though, is he's obviously primarily a striker, but he did come into the Melquizael Costa fight, his last fight, with a very grappling-heavy game plan. Now, before this, I thought, well, most of his fights end up in grappling matches because everyone tries to take him down, but he was the one against Costa who was actively initiating the grappling exchanges. And we know Rodriguez is a pretty good grappler. He'd have to be the hang with the likes of Bashi and Bulgarian, and Raul Rosas Jr. in these fights where these guys have tried to wet blanket him. So he will be the better MMA grappler than Fili. And while Fili's not the easiest to take down, even though Fili trained at Team Alpha Male for pretty much his entire career, Fili is one of these guys that is quite easy to hold down. So in terms of how these two match up stylistically, I would give Rodriguez like a slight edge on the feet, like 60-40 in favour of Rodriguez when it comes to striking, but I would give Rodriguez quite a big advantage on the ground, more like 80-20. He is a much better MMA grappler than Fili. So Rodriguez deserves to be the favourite. I don't know if he should be as big of a favourite as this, but he should win. Pretty boring fight, pretty dead fight for betting. It's very tricky, right? Like, what are you supposed to do with these odds? Rodriguez at an implied probability of around 70%. Far too big of a favourite to be betting in that odds range. But at the same time, Fili is declining. He is second best everywhere. Rodriguez is the better striker, is the better grappler. Even though Rodriguez slowed a bit against Melquizael Costa, he's probably got better cardio as well with how much Fili slowed against Swanson. So it is a bit of a dead fight for betting. The odds are probably where they should be. Very likely this fight goes to a decision. Both guys are absolute decisionators. If you look at Fili's record, tons of decisions throughout his career. And if you look at Rodriguez's record, tons of decisions as well, with 5 of his last 6 going to a decision. And the thing is, styles make fights. Neither of these guys are particularly dangerous. On the feet, they're both volume strikers. On the ground, they're both skilled enough grapplers to defend themselves against submissions. Very, very, very likely this one goes to a decision. I'm actually tempted to bet that. In terms of the props, the only one I would consider would be Rodriguez by decision, but the odds are absolutely shocking. So you'd have to be a foolish person that doesn't understand maths to bet that. So, hope you found that useful. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Miles Johns versus Gene Matsumoto. One of the most interesting fights on this card. We just broke down the Andre Fili versus Christian Rodriguez fight, which actually featured 2 fighters in a similar odds range to this, with Rodriguez about the same odds as Matsumoto and Fili around about the same odds as Johns. And I'll say the same thing about this fight as I said about that one. The odds do feel a bit wide here. And this is one of the most interesting fights on the card because I think Johns is capable of causing Matsumoto big problems. So we'll start off by taking a look at the odds. We can see that Matsumoto is the favourite around 1.40, which is going to be minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. And if we take a look at the odds on Mr. Johns, he's around an average of, say, 3.15, which is going to be plus 215 for an implied probability of 31%. So, where are we? Johns 31 years old, 5'7" with a 66-inch reach. Matsumoto, 25 years old, 5'6" with a 68.5-inch reach. So both guys are about the same size, nothing too major in terms of age either, other than Matsumoto being more inexperienced than Johns. But at 25 years old, he should also be making bigger improvements. So this is a very, very interesting fight. So, very interesting actually. The odds do feel a bit wide on this one. Johns is very, very, very tempting, right? Johns is a very tempting bet. Now, you guys know me. I love to bet on big underdogs. And, you know, in recent times, we've won on two very big underdogs. We hit a very big underdog winner on Derek Lewis to beat Thaleson Teixeira. And we hit another very big underdog winner on Martin Buday to beat Buchecha. So I love betting fighters in this odds range because even if you just win 40% of these bets, over the long term you're going to make a profit. So I love playing fighters in this odds range where the odds feel very wide and the fighter that I'm betting on has a clear and obvious path to victory. So if you go back and watch my breakdown video for the Derek Lewis versus Teixeira fight, it was quite clear that the odds were extremely wide. There was tons of value on Derek Lewis. And Derek Lewis could easily win the fight on merit just by going out and knocking Teixeira out because of how inexperienced Teixeira was. Thankfully, Lewis came through for us big time. If you go back and watch my breakdown video for Martin Buday against Buchecha, it was quite clear if you just took 30 minutes out of your day to watch Buchecha's past fights, the guy was fucking awful. I think people just wiki-capped the fight, saw he'd won some ADCC titles and assumed he'd be a good grappler. But if you watch his actually past MMA fights, you would have seen his MMA grappling was fucking shocking. And obviously in my breakdown video for that fight, I showed plenty of footage from actual MMA fights highlighting how bad Buchecha was on the ground. And I said, look, MMA grappling is very, very different to traditional martial arts grappling. And ADCC titles don't mean a whole lot of fucking anything. If they did, the top 10 of every division would be full of ADCC champions, and it isn't. So Buday came through for us a big underdog as well. The thing about Buday, the thing about Derek Lewis, though, the reason why they were such good bets at big underdog odds was because they could genuinely have been just much better than their opponents, and Buday kind of was. Even though he made it ugly, he was. And Lewis just sent Teixeira to the Shadow Realm early. So while I do like Miles Johns in this fight, and he is a very tempting bet, he's not the kind of big underdog that I usually go for. Because when I bet on big underdogs like Lewis or Martin Buday, I'm betting on them because I think the odds are wide. I don't rate Thaleson Teixeira, he's unproven. I don't rate Buchecha, his MMA grappling was dreadful in his past MMA fights. So I believe Buday and I believe Lewis are capable of winning on merit just by being the better fighters everywhere, right? They come through for us. This fight is a little bit different because we know a lot about both Miles Johns and Gene Matsumoto. And while the odds are wide, and while Johns is a very live underdog here, I don't see any situation in which Johns wins easily, right? Because he's not a finisher. If you look at his record, you know, he's been to a decision in, you know, his last sort of 5 fights, and even the 3 fights before that almost went to a decision, right? 3 fights ended in round 3. So Johns is not a finisher. He doesn't really have power in his hands. He's not dangerous on the ground. He's very much a volume striker. And if you look at Matsumoto's record, he's been to a decision in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In 8 of his last 11. So both these guys are decisionators. So straight away we know this fight is very likely to go to a decision. And we know both guys are very good everywhere, right? Both guys are difficult to take down and hold down. Both guys are aggressive. Both fight at a high pace. And so, yeah, man, this is one of those matchups where I don't feel confident either way. There's no specific path to victory for Johns. I would just be very surprised if this were one-sided, right? And if you look at the implied probability on Matsumoto's odds, around, just call it like what, 1.40. 1.40 odds carry an implied probability of 71%. So if you understand probability, obviously what this means is the odds are suggesting that Matsumoto has almost no way to lose. I can tell you right now that is just not the case, right? If you're betting a fighter at, an implied probability of 71%, 1.40 minus 250, you should have zero doubt in your mind that this fighter will go out and absolutely dominate and make it look easy. For an implied probability of 71%, they shouldn't have any major weaknesses at all, right? But I guarantee this will be a close competitive fight. And Matsumoto might win, but Miles Johns will make him work every step of the way for it. So, straight away the odds feel very, very off here. But it's impossible for me to feel confident either way. Could you have these guys in the even money odds range? I mean, maybe. I will tell you how I see this fight going. So, Matsumoto lands the harder, more damaging strikes, and he's the stronger MMA grappler. But he's bad defensively. He tends to take a lot of damage in his fights, and Johns probably throws a higher volume over the full 15-minute 3-round period. So Matsumoto might be difficult to keep up with early, but he does fade in fights, whereas Johns throws a high volume in every round of the fight. So with Matsumoto, he may land the harder shots, but he's worse defensively, and he takes a lot of damage in fights. So even though Johns doesn't hit as hard, he does throw a high volume, and he could actually damage Matsumoto more, not because he hits as hard, but because Matsumoto is pretty bad defensively. He reminds me a little bit of Luque in the early days. Totally different styles and stances, but he's like overly aggressive and gets into big exchanges a lot and backs his chin and his toughness and his durability a lot, which means he does eat a lot of shots and take a lot of damage, right? Now, Matsumoto does like to mix up his striking and grappling. We see him go to takedowns a lot in fights, but Johns is very difficult to take down and hold down. Like, very difficult to take down and hold down. And he's got great cardio, so very difficult to wear him down with grappling as well. The way that I see this fight going is Matsumoto will likely win the first round because I think he'll be too powerful, too physically imposing for Johns early. But he does fade as fights wear on, whereas Johns, can go at a high pace of 3 rounds. So I see Johns winning the third round because by the third round, Matsumoto will probably be pretty tired and Johns will be able to dance around him and outpoint him. This fight is going to come down to that swing round. Can Johns do enough to steal round 2? Or does Matsumoto still have enough gas in the tank to take round 2? Because remember, Matsumoto doesn't have bad cardio. He just fades a bit as fights wear on. So the question is, can Johns really pick the pace up in the second half of the fight and backdoor a decision here? I think he's more than capable of doing it, but this is going to be a very, 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 very close matchup. I'd be amazed if this were one-sided. And the thing is, if you understand probabilities, this fight should be one-sided. Because at odds of 1.40 minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%, this should be an easy night's work for Matsumoto, and I promise you it won't be. So if you do want to bet this fight, again, it's an IQ test. You would have to be very foolish to bet on Gene Matsumoto in this odds range. As much as I like Matsumoto, I think he's got a really bright future in the sport, and I think he's excellent for 25 years old. You've got to let the odds do the work for you. Take your bias and, ignore how you feel about this fight and just focus on the odds. Focus on the odds. If you bet $1,000 on Matsumoto, you're going to get $400 back if he wins. You're going to lose $1,000 if he loses. If you bet $1,000 on Miles Johns, you'll get $2,115 profit, and you'll only lose $1,000 if he loses. Far better risk to reward ratio on Johns. Betting fights like this is an IQ test. So in terms of the over-under, obviously we've said both guys like to go to decisions a lot. This one's very likely to go to a decision as well. Having said that, again, even though this fight is most likely to go to a decision, the odds reflect that, with the decision odds being at an implied probability of, again, 70%, 1.40 minus 250. So if you do want to bet the over-under on this fight, you've kind of got to take the under. You got to take inside the distance and let the odds do the work for you. It's not the most likely outcome, but it is the bet that gives you the better risk to reward ratio, because to be fair to both these two, they are very aggressive. They do go toe to toe. They do get into big exchanges, and while they're both tough, while they are both well rounded, fight ends inside the distance, going to give you a far better risk to reward ratio than fight goes to a decision. You have to let the odds do the work for you. Most likely outcome for the props, I would go John's by decision, 5.0 plus 400, but in percentage terms the odds are only about 40% better than John's money line. So do you want to get greedy, go for that extra 40%, or play it safe, go for John's money line? I'll probably just take John's money line. We're in the most interesting fights on the card. Hopefully we can make some money live betting this one. I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the fight between Erceg Hernandez and Christian Leroy Duncan. So Duncan is another really big favourite on this card. Average odds of about 1.19, which is going to be minus 526 for an implied probability of 84%. If we take a look at the odds on Hernandez, he's around an average of 4.80, which is going to be plus 380 for an implied probability of 21%. So Hernandez is 38 years old, 6'1" with a 75-inch reach. And Duncan, 30 years old, 6'2" with a 79-inch reach. So nice 4-inch reach advantage there for Duncan. And he is also 8 years younger than Hernandez, which statistically gives him around about a 70% chance of winning. And Duncan also, on top of that, is at that stage in his career at 30 years old where he should be making big improvements from fight to fight, whereas Hernandez at 38 years old should be declining a lot from fight to fight. Although he has put in some decent performances recently, similar to Angela Hill, bit of an outlier. You can see, won his last 2 fights, which is a bit of an improvement on all this choppiness here. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, on the feet, Hernandez is obviously in a lot of trouble. He's very much a volume striker, doesn't really have the power to hurt guys on the feet. And we know that Duncan is an absolute sniper when it comes to striking. Very technical, true legit knockout power, very, very good striker. This will be very one-sided if it stays standing. Duncan's nasty in the clinch, true legit knockout power. Hernandez is going to get lit up if this fight stays standing. But to be fair, earlier on in the breakdown video between Angela Hill and Yasmin Lucindo, we were talking about how Lucindo kind of got exposed against Amanda Lemos because no one tried to take her down in her first 5 UFC fights, and then Lemos dominated her with grappling. I'm not saying that's going to happen this weekend, but we don't know anything about Duncan's takedown offense or ground game. If you take a look at his record, he's only fought strikers. Todorovic didn't really try to take him down. Petrosian striker, Chulinin striker, Ribeiro striker, Rodriguez, obviously likes to stand and bang, and Pulev striker. So if Hernandez were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he might be able to cause Duncan big problems. Hernandez prefers to stand and bang and mix it up in the clinch, but for all we know, Duncan could be terrible on the ground. So that is a risk factor big enough to rule out betting Duncan in this odds range. He is very, very likely to win. I'd be very surprised if Duncan were to lose this, but obviously without knowing enough about his ground game, very risky to bet him at this massive odds range. So easy pass. If you bet Hernandez, old guy, outgunned big time on the feet, you're probably going to lose your money, but very little upside in betting Duncan as this big of a favourite. In terms of the over-under, Hernandez obviously been a bit of a decisionator throughout his career. You see lots of decisions. Duncan, not the most aggressive, been to a decision in his last 2. Although we did see how tough Pulev was last week. And Rodriguez obviously pretty tough as well. For me personally, obviously the fight ends inside the distance is at dog odds. If I were to bet the over-under on this one, I would take fight ends inside the distance, just because I don't think it's that likely Hernandez takes Duncan down. And if the fight stays standing, I think 15 minutes is a long time for Hernandez to survive in front of Duncan without getting KO'd, especially with Hernandez's age. So I would let the odds do the work for me there, take the dog odds on fights ends inside the distance. In terms of the props, the most likely outcome is going to be Duncan by knockout or TKO. But the odds are absolutely terrible. So you might want to give that a miss. Hope you found that breakdown useful. You probably didn't, because this card is dead for betting. But if you want to make some money this weekend, you already know what to do. Join my live betting group. We make a profit on almost 70% of UFC events. Over the last 10 years, we have absolutely crushed it. And if you're not in my live betting group, you're missing out big time. Link in the description below. Have a great week. I'll be back next week for UFC 319, Duplessis versus Chimaev, which is a hell of a lot more of an interesting card than this. But this doesn't matter, because we're still probably going to make money this weekend. And next week when we kick off UFC 319, you already know, and we'll be playing clips of live bets that we won on this weekend's card. So don't miss out. Join the group. Get in on these live bets. Stop sitting on the sidelines. Stop sitting on the fences. You are missing out. Come and join the team. These events this week are our bread and butter. Nice one, guys. Take care. Hope you have a great week. See you all very soon. Nice one, guys. Bye.